At 18,000 feet over the Solomon Islands in August 1943, Lieutenant Richard Bong watched his wingman's P-38 Lightning spiral into the Pacific. 3 Japanese Zeros had ambushed them from above, and now Bong was alone. The lead Zero was closing fast on his tail. He executed every textbook defensive maneuver, hard right bank, full throttle, attempting to outclimb the threat. But the Zero turned tighter, sharper, deadlier. The Japanese pilot was sliding into firing position, and Bong had maybe 4 seconds before 20mm cannon shells ripped through his cockpit and ended everything. What happened next violated every rule he'd been taught. Bong rolled his P-38 completely inverted and yanked the stick forward hard. Instead of climbing away from danger, his aircraft dove straight toward the ocean below. But because he was upside down, he pulled away in a direction the Zero pilot never anticipated, never expected, never trained for. Blood rushed violently to his head. His vision went crimson at the edges, then flooded completely red. For 2 agonizing seconds he was flying blind, unable to read his instruments, unable to see anything but red. When he finally rolled level again at 12,000 feet, the Zero was above him, overshooting wildly, completely out of position. Bong had survived, and he just stumbled onto a combat tactic that would reshape aerial warfare across the entire Pacific theater. This maneuver violated every principle drilled into pilots at flight school. Instructors at training bases across California and Arizona specifically warned against negative G flight, catastrophic engine failure, structural damage, pilot incapacitation, death. The official Air Corps position was crystal clear: never do this. Ever. Yet in actual combat, when a Zero pilot had you locked in his gun sight, those peacetime warnings mattered less than staying alive for the next 5 seconds. The pilots who survived their first brutal encounters with Zeros learned one harsh, undeniable lesson. Conventional aerial combat doctrine, everything they'd been taught in training, was getting Americans killed at an alarming rate. Japanese aviators had refined their tactics through years of relentless combat operations over China and Manchuria. They understood every single advantage their Mitsubishi A6M Zero possessed, every weakness in American fighters, every mistake inexperienced pilots made. American pilots were dying in flames because they fought according to peacetime training manuals against an enemy who had thrown away the rulebook years ago. The story of inverted flight tactics represents something far beyond standard military history. Between 1942 and 1944, a relatively small group of desperate fighter pilots discovered that the human body could withstand physiological stresses that aviation medicine insisted were impossible. They proved their aircraft could handle maneuvers that engineers swore would cause immediate structural failure. Most importantly, they discovered that sometimes survival required flying directly toward the threat, toward the ground, toward death itself, rather than away from it. This wasn't the sanitized heroic version of Pacific air combat that appeared in official after-action reports or newsreels back home. This was desperate, brutal, terrifying innovation, born from absolute necessity, where split-second decisions under extreme stress separated pilots who returned to base from those who became another name carved on a memorial wall. The Mitsubishi A6M Zero entered combat over China in 1940, and by the time America entered World War II in December 1941, Japanese pilots had accumulated thousands upon thousands of combat hours perfecting their deadly tactics. The Zero's performance characteristics created an almost unsolvable problem for Allied aviators. At speeds below 300 miles per hour, the Zero could outturn virtually any fighter aircraft in the sky. Its turning radius at combat speeds was roughly 400 feet tighter than a P-38 Lightning, and nearly 500 feet tighter than an F-4F Wildcat. In a traditional turning dogfight, the exact kind emphasized relentlessly in American training programs, the Zero pilot could simply circle inside his opponent's turn and achieve a killing firing solution within seconds. Early engagement reports from the Philippines, Java, and Burma told a grim, bloody story. American pilots attempted boom and zoom tactics, diving on Zeros from altitude, firing a burst, then climbing away to safety. But if that initial attack failed to destroy the target outright, the Zero pilot would simply enter a tight horizontal turn. When the American pilot tried to follow, tried to finish the kill, he found himself on the outside of the circle, bleeding energy rapidly, becoming the hunted instead of the hunter. By mid-1942, kill ratios in some combat sectors favored Japanese pilots 3-1, sometimes worse. Squadron commanders were filing reports that essentially admitted the brutal truth. We cannot win turning fights against this aircraft. Our men are dying. The F-4F Wildcat, flown by Navy and Marine Corps pilots, had superior diving speed and could absorb significantly more battle damage, but its rate of roll was painfully sluggish. The P-40 Warhawk performed well in vertical maneuvers but suffered badly at higher altitudes, where many engagements occurred. The P-38 Lightning had twin engines for redundancy and devastating firepower, but its wide turning radius made it horribly vulnerable in horizontal combat. Each American fighter type had genuine advantages: heavy firepower, armor protection, dive speed, but none could match the Zero's supernatural agility in conventional maneuvering combat. Pilots were instructed to use their aircraft's strengths, avoid turning engagements at all costs, maintain energy advantage, sensible advice on paper, but combat almost never unfolded according to neat plans drawn on briefing room blackboards. What made this tactical crisis even worse was the exceptional skill level of Japanese naval aviators in 1942 and early 1943. Many had been flying actual combat missions since the late 1930s. They understood energy management, deflection shooting, and formation tactics at an expert level that few Americans could match. They knew exactly how to force American pilots into situations where the Zero's turning ability became absolutely decisive, where American advantages became meaningless. A common Japanese tactic involved 1-0 acting as bait, flying straight and level, appearing vulnerable and isolated. When an eager American pilot committed to the attack, hungry for a kill, 2 more Zeros would suddenly drop from above or slide in from the flanks like sharks. The American fighter was suddenly defensive, fighting for survival, and defensive meant entering a turning fight. And a turning fight meant the Zero's advantages became overwhelming, usually fatal. The mathematics of turning combat are brutally unforgiving. Turn radius depends on velocity and g-force loading. The Zero's lightweight construction, achieved partly by eliminating armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, gave it superior turn performance at the cost of survivability. American fighters carried heavy armor plate behind the pilot's seat, self-sealing fuel tanks, and heavier armament. These features kept pilots alive when hit, absorbed punishment, but they also added hundreds of pounds that increased wing loading and expanded turning radius dramatically. American pilots were essentially being asked to defeat an opponent who owned the single most important advantage in dogfighting, while flying aircraft deliberately optimized for survivability and firepower, rather than maneuverability. It was a losing equation written in blood across Pacific skies. The maneuver that would eventually save countless American lives wasn't derived from aeronautical engineering textbooks or tactical development boards. It didn't emerge from wind tunnel testing or careful analysis. It emerged from raw, desperate, terrified innovation and pure accidental discovery. The split S, as it came to be called informally, involved rolling completely inverted and pulling through into a steep diving turn. In normal flight, pilots experience positive G-forces. Blood is pushed downward toward their feet. Vision narrows progressively, and at around 5 to 6 Gs, many pilots experience grey-out or complete blackout as blood drains from the brain. But when a pilot rolls upside down and pulls the stick forward aggressively, he experiences negative Gs instead. Blood rushes violently upward to the head. The act is called red out because the pilot's entire visual field literally turns deep crimson as blood vessels in the eyes engorge painfully with blood forced upward by the negative acceleration. Aviation medicine in 1942 insisted humans could barely tolerate negative G-forces for more than a second or two. Medical studies indicated that even -2 Gs caused severe discomfort, complete disorientation, and potential permanent retinal damage. Official guidance from flight surgeons recommended avoiding negative G flight entirely under all circumstances. But those medical studies were conducted in sterile, controlled laboratory environments with test pilots who weren't being actively shot at by expert enemy aviators. Combat flying created entirely different mathematics, different priorities. A pilot experiencing 2 or 3 seconds of red-out vision but successfully escaping a Zero's gun solution lived to fight another day. A pilot who maintained perfect positive G flight, followed all the medical guidance, but stayed locked in the Zero's crosshairs died screaming in a burning cockpit. The choice wasn't comfortable flying versus uncomfortable flying, it was temporary blindness and survival versus perfect vision and certain death. The physics behind why the inverted dive worked so effectively involved energy management and opponent prediction and exploitation. When a Zero pilot achieved a classic tail position, locked in behind an American fighter, he naturally anticipated the target would either try to outturn him, which was impossible, or attempt to climb away, which bled the American aircraft's energy and made it an even easier target. The inverted dive did neither. It converted altitude into raw speed in a vector the Zero pilot didn't expect, couldn't predict, and couldn't easily follow. More importantly, if the Japanese pilot attempted to follow an American fighter through an aggressive inverted dive, his own aircraft faced severe structural limitations. The Zero was stressed for positive G loads up to about 7 Gs, but its deliberately lightweight construction made negative G flight particularly dangerous. Pulling hard negative Gs in a Zero risked catastrophic structural failure, wing separation, or serious engine problems because the aircraft's fuel and oil systems simply weren't designed for sustained inverted flight operations. The P-38's twin Allison engines provided another crucial advantage in negative G flight. Unlike single-engine fighters with traditional carbureted engines, which could experience fuel starvation and engine cutout during inverted maneuvers, the P-38's engines used fuel injection systems that functioned far more reliably under negative G loads. This wasn't a designed feature. Lockheed engineers certainly weren't planning for inverted combat tactics when they designed the Lightning, but it became operationally significant in ways nobody anticipated. A P-38 pilot could maintain full power through an inverted dive, while some pursuing aircraft might experience momentary power loss, creating crucial separation. The human body's actual tolerance for negative G-forces turned out to be significantly higher than medical literature suggested, provided the exposure remained brief. Pilots reported that the red-out effect typically lasted only a few seconds during a properly executed split-S. Vision returned rapidly as the aircraft transitioned back to positive G-flight during the pullout. The discomfort was genuinely intense. Pounding headaches, facial petechiae, severely bloodshot eyes, but survivable, manageable. Several pilots noted candidly in debriefings that they'd much rather endure a splitting headache and bloodshot eyes back at base than receive a proper military burial at sea. The informal risk assessment among combat pilots was brutally simple. Negative G maneuvers hurt like hell, but Japanese 20mm cannon shells hurt infinitely worse. Major Thomas Lynch of the 39th Fighter Squadron, flying P-38 Lightnings out of Port Moresby, New Guinea, was the first pilot officially documented to have used the inverted dive tactic deliberately and intentionally, rather than purely instinctively under duress. On April 11, 1943, Lynch led a 4-plane patrol over the Huon Gulf when his formation encountered 8 Zeros at 20,000 feet. Instead of engaging in a traditional horizontal turning fight, Lynch immediately rolled inverted the instant the lead Zero closed on him. He pulled through hard into a steep dive, accelerated rapidly to over 400 miles per hour, then rolled level at 8,000 feet with enormous energy advantage. The Zero pilot attempting to follow him pulled out much earlier at 12,000 feet, either unwilling or physically unable to match Lynch's aggressive dive angle and terrifying speed. Lynch didn't just survive the encounter through luck. He completely reversed the tactical situation. After leveling out with massive speed advantage, he had both altitude separation and superior energy state. He used that energy advantage to climb back up aggressively, this time approaching the now completely disorganized Japanese formation from below, with surprise on his side. The Zeros had lost all their tactical cohesion, scattered and chasing after what they mistakenly thought were fleeing American fighters. Lynch methodically shot down 2 Zeros in the ensuing engagement. His wingmen, following his lead through the inverted dive, all survived without losses or even significant damage. The official after-action report noted the unusual tactic but didn't emphasize it particularly. Official doctrine still strongly discouraged negative G maneuvers as dangerous and unreliable. What made Lynch's action genuinely significant was conscious intentionality. Plenty of other pilots had rolled inverted under extreme duress, survived by pure luck or instinct, and chalked it up to random fortune. Lynch recognized it as a repeatable, teachable technique with genuine tactical applications. Within a week, he was actively teaching the maneuver to other pilots in his squadron during informal evening briefings. The instruction was elegantly simple. If a Zero gets locked on your tail in a position where you cannot shake him using conventional maneuvers, immediately roll inverted, pull through hard, dive aggressively, and use the resulting speed to create separation. Never try to outturn him horizontally. Always use the vertical dimension. The Zero completely owns the horizontal circle, but American fighters owned the vertical dive through superior structural strength and dive speed. By June 1943, the tactic had spread organically to other P-38 units operating out of Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. Pilots shared the technique during ready room discussions and inter-squadron debriefings after missions. It remained largely unofficial, neither explicitly prohibited nor formally endorsed in official tactical directives. Squadron leaders recognized its combat effectiveness clearly, but hesitated to put it in writing officially. The concern was partly institutional liability. If a pilot was killed attempting the maneuver, uncomfortable questions would inevitably arise about who specifically authorized teaching a tactic that directly contradicted established training doctrine. So it spread exclusively through word of mouth, experienced combat pilots showing newer arrivals how to execute it without ever documenting the instruction in official training materials. The 4075th Fighter Group, arriving fresh in the Southwest Pacific Theater in August 1943, received informal but thorough briefings on the inverted dive tactic from hardened veterans of the 49th Fighter Group. Major Charles McDonald, who would eventually become one of the Pacific Theater's leading aces with 27 confirmed kills, later credited the split S maneuver with directly saving his life on at least 3 separate occasions. His detailed combat reports from late 1943 show a clear tactical pattern: engage Zeros from altitude advantage, make a single high-speed firing pass, if counterattacked during the climb back up to altitude, immediately roll inverted and dive away, reset the entire engagement on favorable terms with energy advantage. It wasn't elegant, graceful dogfighting like the movies. It was industrial-strength survival mathematics that happened to consistently produce victories. The physiological cost of negative G flight was something no training manual or flight surgeon briefing adequately prepared pilots for. During a typical split S maneuver, pulling -2 to -3 Gs, blood pressure in the head increased dramatically and suddenly. Pilots universally reported an immediate sensation of intense, almost unbearable pressure behind the eyes, followed instantly by the red-out effect where their entire visual field turned deep crimson, then completely red. The crushing pressure came from blood vessels in the retina, and conjunctiva engorging rapidly with blood forced violently upward by the negative acceleration. For those critical 2 to 3 seconds, a pilot was effectively flying completely blind, relying entirely on kinesthetic sense, spatial awareness and instrument memory to maintain aircraft control, while unable to see anything at all. Flight surgeon Captain James Moorhead, stationed at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal in late 1943, systematically documented the physical aftermath of these brutal maneuvers. He examined dozens of pilots who regularly employed inverted dive tactics in combat. Nearly all showed extensive petechial hemorrhaging, tiny broken blood vessels creating distinctive red spots across their faces, particularly concentrated around the eyes and forehead. Some experienced subconjunctival hemorrhages that left their eyes dramatically blood red for days afterward. Severe, pounding headaches were universal, without exception, A few pilots reported temporary vision problems, blurred sight or difficulty focusing that persisted for several hours after landing. Moorhead's unofficial conclusion, never published in any medical journal, was that the maneuvers definitely caused measurable, visible physical damage, but apparently nothing permanently debilitating or career-ending. The far greater risk was the moment of complete blindness itself. During those few terrifying seconds of total red-out, a pilot couldn't see his altimeter, airspeed indicator, or attitude instruments. He certainly couldn't see enemy aircraft or the ground rushing up at him at hundreds of miles per hour. The maneuver required absolute, total commitment. A pilot had to establish the correct dive angle, pull the necessary negative Gs, then hold that control input blindly until his vision cleared, trusting completely that he'd judged his starting altitude correctly before rolling inverted. Several fatal training accidents occurred when pilots initiated the maneuver too low or held the dive too long without visual reference. There was zero margin for error at 5,000 feet altitude. At 15,000 feet, a pilot had precious seconds to recognize and correct mistakes. The mathematical calculation became fundamental to survival. Never ever go inverted below 8,000 feet unless death is otherwise absolutely certain. Experienced combat pilots gradually developed personal techniques to minimize the red-out duration. Some learned to aggressively tense their neck and facial muscles, attempting to physically restrict blood flow to the head. Others discovered through trial and error that if they rolled inverted but pulled less aggressively on the stick, deliberately trading maximum maneuver performance for slightly better vision, they could maintain marginal partial sight throughout the maneuver. This became an instantaneous judgment call in combat. Maximum negative G input generated the fastest possible separation from a pursuing zero, but caused complete total visual blackout for crucial seconds. Moderate negative G input allowed the pilot to maintain some degraded visual reference, but significantly reduced the effectiveness of the escape. In actual practice, most pilots consistently chose maximum separation. Far better to be completely blind for 3 seconds and survive than semi-aware and get shot down anyway. The psychological aspect was equally challenging and perhaps harder to overcome. Human beings have powerful evolutionary instincts against voluntary actions that cause severe pain and complete sensory deprivation. Voluntarily inducing temporary total blindness while someone with expert training is actively trying to kill you runs counter to every survival instinct evolution built into us. Yet combat pilots learned to consciously override that deep instinct through repeated exposure and desperate necessity. The first time was absolutely terrifying, primal fear. The second time was still genuinely frightening. By the 5th or 6th time, it became just another deeply unpleasant aspect of combat flying. Like heavy flak, like careful fuel management, like watching close friends die burning in crashed aircraft. The body adapted through exposure. The mind adapted through necessity. What seemed completely impossible in a safe training environment became merely routine when the only alternative was a 20mm high-explosive cannon shell detonating in your cockpit. The inverted dive tactic moved through the sprawling Pacific theater like an underground transmission, spreading organically from squadron to squadron without ever appearing in official tactical publications or training directives. By September 1943, P-38 units scattered across New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were routinely teaching the maneuver to replacement pilots during their very first week in theatre, before they'd even flown their first combat mission. The instruction always happened informally, never officially. Veteran pilots pulling new arrivals aside after evening mess, quietly describing in brutal detail what actually worked in combat and what got people killed fast. Squadron commanders absolutely knew it was happening right under their noses. Some actively encouraged it with knowing looks. Others deliberately pretended not to notice, carefully maintaining plausible deniability in case 5th Air Force Headquarters ever asked uncomfortable questions about unauthorized training methods. Colonel Neil Kirby, commanding the 348th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts out of Port Moresby, formally incorporated the Split S into his unit's official tactical doctrine in October 1943. The massive P-47 was even heavier than the P-38, making it hopelessly, laughably outmatched in turning combat against Zeros. But the Thunderbolt could dive faster than almost anything in the sky, and its bulletproof radial engine handled negative G flight reasonably well without immediately quitting. Kirby's approach was ruthlessly pragmatic and honest. He told his pilots explicitly, in direct language, that if they tried to turn with a zero, they would die, period. If they intelligently used the P-47's massive weight and raw power to dictate vertical engagements, hard diving attacks followed by inverted escapes when tactically necessary, they would survive and win consistently. Kirby personally shot down 6 Japanese aircraft on October 11, 1943, using exactly these tactics. He received the Medal of Honor for that mission. Marine Corps F-4U Corsair squadrons adopted similar aggressive techniques in early 1944. The beautiful Corsair had performance advantages over the Zero in most parameters except pure turning radius. Marine pilots operating from primitive island bases like Munda and Vella La Vella discovered that the inverted dive actually worked even better in the powerful Corsair than in twin-engine fighters. The F-4U's massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine maintained full thrust through negative G maneuvers without hesitation. And the aircraft's exceptional structural strength meant pilots could pull out of dives at much higher speeds without worrying about catastrophic wing failure. Major Robert Gaylor, teaching advanced tactics to VMF-2 Fort Fee, the famous Black Sheep Squadron, demonstrated the maneuver repeatedly and explicitly, strongly emphasizing that it was purely a defensive escape tactic, never an offensive weapon to be used aggressively. By mid-1944, the technique had reached Navy carrier squadrons operating in the Central Pacific Campaign. Fighter pilots flying from fleet carriers like USS Essex and USS Lexington received formal briefings that now included inverted maneuvers as accepted, standard tactics. The official terminology varied widely between units. Some called it a split S, others referred to it as a negative G brake, some simply described it colloquially as rolling out downward. The specific language didn't matter at all. The execution was universally consistent when conventional defensive maneuvers failed completely, immediately invert and dive hard. The safety threshold remained consistently around 8,000 feet across all units. Below that critical altitude, pilots were explicitly instructed to use other escape options or grimly accept that they were in an unavoidable fight to the death. Not all aircraft types could safely perform the maneuver reliably. Navy F-6F Hellcat pilots reported that their carbureted engines sometimes coughed badly or quit entirely during sustained inverted flight, though they usually restarted quickly enough. Army Air Force P-40 pilots found their aircraft structurally sound enough for the maneuver, but seriously lacking the dive performance necessary to create sufficient separation from pursuing Zeros. These significant limitations meant that tactics remained aircraft-specific, not universal. A P-38 pilot could confidently rely on the inverted dive as a primary defensive tool in his tactical arsenal. A P-40 pilot absolutely needed different escape options. The underlying principle, however, had become universal across the entire theatre. Vertical maneuvers, including inverted flight when tactically necessary, beat horizontal turning fights every single time. Japanese pilots eventually recognized the American inverted dive tactic and attempted to develop effective countermeasures. By late 1943, after-action combat reports from returning Zero pilots increasingly mentioned American fighters rolling inverted and diving away at impossibly high speeds. Initial Japanese tactical assessments viewed this purely as a defensive maneuver, clear evidence that American pilots fundamentally feared close combat and were fleeing rather than fighting like warriors. This interpretation was strategically catastrophic for Japanese airmen because it reinforced their existing tactical doctrine and cultural assumptions, while completely missing the actual tactical threat. The inverted dive wasn't cowardly retreat or running away. It was a tactical reset that allowed American pilots to deliberately choose when and how to re-engage on overwhelmingly favorable terms with energy advantage. Some aggressive Japanese pilots tried following American fighters through inverted dives to maintain contact. The results were often immediately fatal. The Zero's deliberately lightweight construction, which gave it supernatural turning performance, became a critical liability in high-speed vertical maneuvers. The aircraft's airframe was stressed adequately for positive G limits, but had dangerously reduced safety margins in negative G flight. Several Zero pilots who attempted to follow P-38s through aggressive inverted dives experienced terrifying control surface flutter or outright structural failure. Others discovered that their Nakajima Sakai engines experienced severe fuel delivery problems during inverted flight, causing complete power loss at the absolute worst possible moment, mid-dive, while desperately trying to keep an enemy aircraft in gunsight. A thoroughly documented incident from December 1944 over Leyte Gulf illustrated the tactic's brutal lethality when Zero pilots attempted to counter it directly. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas McGuire, flying a P-38, was engaged by 4 Zeros at 18,000 feet. When the lead Zero achieved what should have been a killing firing position, McGuire instantly rolled inverted and dove. The experienced Japanese pilot aggressively followed, determined to maintain contact and finish the kill. Two things happened simultaneously. McGuire's P-38 accelerated smoothly past 450 miles per hour in the dive while maintaining complete structural integrity. The pursuing Zero began experiencing severe uncontrollable vibration around 380 miles per hour. The Japanese pilot was forced to pull out early or risk immediate airframe failure and death. McGuire leveled confidently at 6,000 feet, then climbed back into the fight with overwhelming energy advantage and shot down 2 of the 4 Zeros methodically. The other 2 wisely disengaged and fled. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that their most effective aircraft, the legendary Zero, was optimized for completely the wrong kind of combat by late 1944. Early in the war, when engagements typically occurred at medium altitudes and involved prolonged turning fights, the Zero's characteristics were absolutely ideal, perfect for the tactical environment. But as American tactics evolved rapidly toward high-speed slashing attacks and vertical maneuvers exploiting energy advantage, the Zero's advantages became increasingly irrelevant. Meanwhile, its disadvantages, lack of armor protection, lightweight structure, lower dive speed, became absolutely critical, often fatal vulnerability. Japanese aircraft designers clearly recognized this enormous problem. Later model Zero variants and newer designs like the J2M Raiden had genuinely improved dive performance and significantly stronger structures. But these aircraft arrived in pathetically limited numbers and far too late to change the overall tactical balance. Japanese training programs simply couldn't adapt quickly enough either. By 1944, Japan was losing irreplaceable experienced pilots far faster than they could possibly be replaced with adequately trained pilots. New pilots received drastically abbreviated training that emphasized only basic flight skills and traditional dogfighting tactics. There wasn't sufficient time, fuel, or experienced instructors to teach advanced energy management or vertical combat techniques. Meanwhile, American training programs had systematically incorporated hard lessons learned from experienced combat veterans. Replacement pilots arriving fresh in the Pacific theater in late 1944 already knew thoroughly about inverted dive tactics before they ever flew their very first combat mission. The critical knowledge gap had completely reversed. Japanese pilots, once the most experienced and skilled in the entire theater, were now often the least prepared for the war's actual tactical environment. The inverted dive tactics developed desperately over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945 didn't simply disappear when World War II ended. They became permanently embedded in fighter tactics doctrine worldwide, though often without any attribution to the desperate innovations of P-38 and Corsair pilots fighting for survival. Modern fighter combat training at elite institutions like the Navy Fighter Weapons School, universally known as Top Gun, includes negative G maneuvers as completely standard defensive tactics. The precise terminology has changed over decades. Contemporary pilots call it a negative G pushover or unloaded roll, but the fundamental physics and tactical purpose remain absolutely identical to what Thomas Lynch figured out over New Guinea in April 1943. The Korean War saw American pilots employing essentially similar tactics against Soviet-built MiG-15s. The sleek jet fighter had excellent high-altitude performance and could outturn most American aircraft in horizontal combat. F-86 Sabre pilots facing precisely analogous problems to what P-38 pilots encountered against Zeros routinely used vertical maneuvers and negative G escapes when MiGs achieved advantageous firing positions. Captain Joseph McConnell, the top American ace of the Korean War with 16 confirmed kills, explicitly credited his survival in several desperate engagements to what he described as rolling out underneath pursuing MiGs, precisely the same inverted dive concept, now applied to jet combat at 40,000 feet altitude and 600 miles per hour. Vietnam-era fighter pilots painfully rediscovered these fundamental lessons the hard way. Early in that controversial conflict, American pilots trained almost exclusively for beyond visual range missile combat suddenly found themselves in unexpected close-range dogfights against nimble MiG-17s and MiG-21s. The initial engagement results were disturbingly poor. The establishment of Top Gun in 1969 at Naval Air Station Miramar represented explicit institutional acknowledgement that dogfighting skills, including negative G defensive maneuvers, remained absolutely critical despite impressive technological advances in missiles and radar. Instructors at Top Gun taught aggressive tactics that Pacific War veterans would have recognized immediately and instinctively. Use your specific aircraft strengths decisively, ruthlessly avoid the enemy's advantages, and when forced defensive, go vertical and inverted if tactically necessary. Modern fighter aircraft are deliberately designed with robust negative G capability built directly into their systems. The F-16, F-A-18 and F-35 all have sophisticated fuel systems, engine designs and structural strength that allow sustained negative G flight without any of the severe limitations that plagued World War II aircraft. Pilots train extensively in centrifuges to build physiological tolerance for both positive and negative G forces. The redout effect that absolutely terrified pilots in 1943 is now a thoroughly known and effectively manageable phenomenon. But the underlying tactical principle fundamentally hasn't changed across 8 decades. Negative G flight allows maneuvers that opponents simply don't anticipate or expect, creating crucial separation and opportunities for effective counterattack. What makes the Pacific War innovation truly remarkable is that it happened entirely outside official channels and institutional structures. No aeronautical engineer deliberately designed the tactic. No tactical development board carefully studied and approved it. No training command incorporated it into official syllabi until after combat pilots had already proven its effectiveness through hundreds of desperate combat engagements. It spread exclusively through the Warrior Network. Experienced pilots teaching critical survival skills to new arrivals person to person, squadron to squadron, based purely on what actually worked when people were trying to kill you. The men who developed these tactics rarely received any recognition beyond their immediate units. Most never knew their desperate improvised solutions would directly influence fighter combat doctrine for the next 80 years. Richard Bong, America's top ace with 40 confirmed victories, survived the brutal war partly because he thoroughly mastered vertical combat and wasn't afraid to fly inverted when desperate circumstances demanded it. Thomas Lynch, who first employed the tactic deliberately and intentionally, was killed in action over the Philippines in March 1944, not because his innovative tactics failed him, but because combat flying was statistically lethal regardless of skill level, experience, or tactical knowledge. Their genuine legacy isn't preserved in medals, official commendations, or recognition. It's in the fact that fighter pilots today, right now, still train routinely to roll inverted and push negative G when forced defensive. A direct, unbroken lineage to desperate innovations made in cramped cockpits over the vast Pacific, where survival absolutely required rewriting all the rules during flight.